Okay, guys, we should be on the second page of our notes for secondary succession. So something that I want to mention about secondary succession is notice the difference in the picture that we had before. The difference is for primary succession, we had bare rock. There was nothing living here. But see how there's, for secondary succession, there's already soil here, there's already plant life, and something is causing it to change over time, but then eventually once you get to this point, it's the same as primary succession. So we're going to kind of talk about that. Okay, so as you notice here, this is soil depth. This is tall trees. There was life here at one point. Okay, so that's the big difference between primary and secondary succession. Secondary begins with soil. So remember I said that the P of primary, if you draw the little line, it can look like an R. So primary begins with rock. Well, secondary, that starts with an S, begins with soil. Okay, that's a little trick that can help you. All right, see if we can move on. So secondary succession is a sequence of changes that takes place after existing community is severely disrupted. So that would be an example of a fire, like a big forest fire that pretty much completely burns everything on top of the soil, right? So it's burning everything on top of the soil, but it leaves the soil intact, and there might be some seeds, there might be some things inside of the soil. So it doesn't take as long for things to start growing, right? The other one was hundreds of years just to kind of even get it to start. But here you've got a couple of years. After that forest fire, you've got some seeds down in here where some small grasses can start to grow. Okay, so many organisms are destroyed, but the soil is safe. So we're talking about this forest fire that might happen here. We could also be talking about a tornado. We could be talking about a hurricane, but one that we typically use is a forest fire. But in that area where the succession occurred, organisms, their home, their life, that can all be destroyed, but the soil stays safe. Okay, and again, the soil contains seeds, and it has seeds of weeds and grasses and trees, and it begins again, but the pioneer species different. Okay, so we're going to talk about what that pioneer species is. But because there's soil present, like I mentioned before, succession happens a lot faster. There's already soil. It doesn't have to happen over years and years of things dying and causing soil to be created. Soil is already there. Okay, guys, I went ahead and switched something on your notes. Hopefully it is switched on your notes, but if not, you can go ahead and switch it. But this disruption may stem from a natural disaster. So it has forest fire in parentheses, and then it had volcanic eruption, which isn't true. A volcanic eruption is primary succession. So let's make sure that your notes say hurricane, right? So a forest fire, a hurricane, or even from human activities such as farming too much, logging, taking all the plants down, all the trees, and mining. So these are some ways that secondary succession can occur. A big one is a forest fire, but they've also talked about hurricanes and tornadoes kind of ripping through. You know, you can even have a huge flood here from a hurricane, but it's not going to really disturb that soil. Okay, so this is kind of what it would look like if a forest fire went through and kind of burnt everything through. You still have your soil underneath. So then after your soil and everything underneath has, crisped over, I guess you'd say, then your seeds that are still in the soil can start to grow. So you'll start to, within a year or so, start to get these small grasses. And then over time, the small grasses in the area will kind of start to die off and then cause even more soil and dirt to grow, just like primary succession did. You get the larger grasses, you start getting the larger shrubs, and then the larger trees, and they both go to a climax community. Okay, so succession can lead to the regrowth of a forest. Which statement concerning the diversity of life during succession is correct? So we're thinking about diversity, okay? So how diverse something is. Diversity can only be seen in a stable community. Diversity remains unchanged as succession proceeds. Diversity is greatest in the pioneer community, which is at the beginning, or diversity is greatest in the stable community. Okay, so this is a hard question considering you're just learning this. And we'll talk about these two words many, many times. But if we look back at, let's see, this picture here. They're basically saying, is diversity the most here, where it's the most diverse, or do you have the most diversity here? So your most diversity would be in your stable or climax community, because this is where you have the most different types of plants and animals and dirt and soil, so that seeds, all kinds of things are in this area. Larger animals are there. So you have the most diversity there. So your answer would be D, at your stable or climax community. Okay, again, not at the very beginning where the first things are starting to grow, because then that's all you have. And then diversity certainly changes over time as succession goes on. And then it's not true that diversity can only be seen in a stable community. It's the greatest at the climax or stable community, but you can see it in other places. You can see that there's diversity even in the middle and at the beginning. Okay, so key points. How do they each begin? Let's look at this picture. This picture begins with bare rock. So is it primary or secondary? That's an important key that you need to be able to look at these pictures and determine. Again, everything from this point on looks the same, looks pretty much the same in primary and secondary. It's the beginning part that you've got to realize. Bare rock has no life there, it's just rock. It happened from like a volcanic eruption or from ice melting there. So what type of succession is it? Pause it, make sure that you know it before you wait for my answer. Okay, so just pause it and think what you would think it would be. All right, so this is primary succession. Hopefully you guys got that right. Because primary P, and if you draw the little line, it looks like an R, primary begins with rock. Okay, bare rock. All right, oh, I already gave you the answer. Well, we're going to look at it. So again, this one is bare rock, exposed rock, and then it goes through the lichens, which is the primary consumer, I'm sorry, the pioneer species, and then it goes on through time. So what would this one be, right? Even though the question's not asking it, pause it for a minute and tell me which one do you think this would be. Would this be primary succession or secondary succession? Okay, this would be primary succession because again, rocks, it begins with rocks. So now we'll move on to the question that you already saw the answer to. Which general conclusions can an ecologist make when contrasting pioneer with climax communities? So pioneer here with the climax community. Like the first thing to grow is the pioneer with the climax community, which is where everything is great. Okay, so the soil or the biomass and the diversity increase over time. That is true, because as each thing dies, you start to get more and more soil for the next thing to live there. And also the diversity changes, right? Because if all we have are lichens and mosses here, then there's very low to no diversity, especially with the rocks, there's no diversity. But as we get here, we get a lot more things in the area, so the diversity is very great. Okay, so it doesn't decrease over time, it certainly increases. And biodiversity does not remain constant, it certainly increases over time. And biodiversity does not decrease, it increases over time. So the only one that makes sense is A. I hope this makes sense to you. And so we'll kind of go through some pictures and some examples of making sure that you understand. So like this picture here, this picture, excuse me, shows grass. You see greenery, you see grass there. So this would have to be secondary succession because there's life there. It doesn't begin with bare rock, so it's going to be secondary succession.